Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive 3D initiative of UPSC with Sarab Kaushik.
Glad to be here.
So, imagine discovering that the smartphone in your pocket, right, or the missile system defending our borders, or even the EV in your driveway, all of it relies on this single pinch of chemical magic dust.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Right. And, one increasingly hostile nation controls nearly 90% of it. So whether you are actively prepping for the UPSC exams or you just want to understand the massive tectonic shifts happening in our world today, you are in the right place.
You really are.
Because today we're taking this incredibly diverse stack of information. I mean, we're going from international treaties and military strikes all the way to domestic evictions and corporate audits.
It's a huge span.
It is. We've got 7 distinct topics on the docket today. We're moving from the shores of the Indo-Pacific right into the accounting ledgers of India's largest private bank.
Yeah, and as I was pouring through the raw data for all this, the legal briefs, the geopolitical analysis, a really clear, unifying theme started to bleed through every single page.
Oh, really? What was it?
Structural integrity.
Okay, structural integrity.
Yeah, basically we are looking at what happens when the core systems that govern our world are subjected to just immense stress.
Right.
So we're going to explore how nations secure global supply chains against monopolies, how navies maintain the physical sanctity of sea lanes.
Which is huge right now.
Absolutely. And also how the government tracks demographic shifts, how administrators try to ensure fairness in these high-stakes medical exams, and, how regulators demand actual ethical reality in corporate banking.
So every topic today is basically a stress test of the structures you and I rely on every single day.
Exactly. Every single one.
Well, let's unpack this by starting with the literal building blocks of our 21st century reality. So on May 26, 2026, right on the sidelines of the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting in New Delhi, EAMS Jaishankar and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down at Hyderabad House.
Right, the big signing.
Yeah, and they signed this major agreement. It's called the India-U.S. Framework on Critical Minerals and Rare Earths.
Right.
And the U.S. State Department is framing this as this, tangible, physical manifestation of the strategic alliance between the two nations.
Covering everything from mining to recycling.
Yeah, extraction, processing, financing. But I want to strip away the diplomatic jargon for a second. We hear the term critical minerals thrown around constantly.
Maritime.
India's Ministry of Mines has identified 30 of them, things like lithium and cobalt. And then we have these 17 rare earth elements.
REs, yeah.
Right. Walk me through the mechanics here. Like, what physically makes these 17 elements so critical that the U.S. and India are signing dedicated bilateral frameworks just to manage them?
Well, to understand the geopolitics, you really have to look at the chemistry and the physics first.
Okay.
These 17 rare earth elements, which include the lanthanide series on the periodic table, plus scandium and yttrium, they are the fundamental enablers of modern tech.
Like, we literally couldn't build stuff without them.
We literally couldn't. They possess these unique magnetic, luminescent, and electrochemical properties that you just cannot replicate with other metals.
Right.
Let's take neodymium, for example. If you want to build a permanent magnet for an EV motor or the generator inside a wind turbine, you need neodymium.
And if you don't have it?
Without it, the motor is either incredibly weak or just prohibitively massive. You can't build an advanced semiconductor, a catalytic converter, or, modern defense systems without it.
So like the guidance fins on a precision missile.
Exactly. Or the optics and night vision goggles. You need these specific elements.
I'm trying to visualize the scale of this dependency. It feels somewhat like the yeast in a bakery.
Okay, I like that.
Like, if you're baking bread, the bulk of your material is flour and water, right?
Right.
Which in our tech analogy would be the steel, the aluminum, the plastics.
Right, the bulk.
But you only need this tiny microscopic pinch of yeast. But if you don't have that yeast, the bread simply does not rise.
It's just a flat rock.
Yeah. If you don't have that pinch of neodymium or dysprosium, the fighter jet doesn't fly, and the wind turbine doesn't generate power.
The bakery analogy captures the volume discrepancy perfectly. But let's take a step further to understand the actual crisis here.
Okay, what's the crisis?
Imagine if the guy selling the yeast also owned the only ovens in town.
Oh, wow.
And suddenly he decided he didn't like you very much. That is the global supply chain reality right now.
So China is the guy with the ovens.
Exactly. And the term rare earth is actually a bit of a misnomer.
Really? They aren't rare.
Not really. They're relatively abundant in the Earth's crust, The rarity and the extreme bottleneck lies in the process.
Okay, process.
Right. China currently mines roughly 60% of global rare earths, which is a lot.
Mm.
But the terrifying statistic for policymakers is that China controls 85 to 90% of the processing and refining capacity.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there. If the dirt is in the ground all over the world, why is the processing so hyper-concentrated?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Is it just a matter of cheap labor, or is there like a mechanical barrier to entry?
Oh, it is a massive mechanical and environmental barrier. These 17 elements are chemically very similar to one another. And in nature, they clump together in the exact same ore deposits.
So they're all mixed up.
Right. You don't just dig up a chunk of pure neodymium. You dig up a rock containing a dozen different elements, often laced with radioactive thorium or uranium.
Jeez, radioactive.
Yeah. To separate them, you have to put the crushed ore through hundreds of sequential solvent extraction phases using incredibly toxic acid baths.
Wow.
It is an environmentally hazardous, highly toxic, and just technically grueling process.
So Western nations basically just outsourced this dirty work to China over the last 3 decades.
Exactly. Because of looser environmental regulations and heavy state subsidies, China spent 30 years mastering the metallurgy and basically cornering the intellectual property of this processing.
And the catalyst for this new India-US agreement seems to be China finally weaponizing that 30-year monopoly, right?
They finally pulled the lever.
Because if we look at the timeline, the panic really accelerated in October 2025. China imposed severe export controls on gallium and germanium.
Right.
And these aren't even rare earths, right? They're minor metals, but they're absolutely essential for semiconductors and fiber optics.
And China controls over 80% of the global supply of those two.
Exactly. So that export ban just sent shockwaves through the global tech industry. It was this stark demonstration that relying on a single rival for your fundamental building blocks is just a catastrophic liability.
It was the ultimate wake-up call. I mean, it completely accelerated the strategic vision that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump initially laid out back at their Washington summit in early 2025.
The focus shifted overnight.
Yeah, the entire focus shifted to creating trusted, secure, and resilient supply chains.
But let's look at India's actual leverage here, because we aren't starting from scratch. When you look at the raw geological data, India is sitting on the world's 5th largest reserves of rare earth elements.
Right, around 6.9 million tons?
Yeah, 6.9 million tons. And this is managed by the Atomic Minerals Directorate. We even have IRL Limited actively processing beach sand minerals in coastal states like Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Kerala.
So we have the raw dirt.
Exactly. We have the dirt. We even have some basic separation facilities. But if we lack that advanced high-purity processing tech that China has, what is the actual nature of this deal with the U.S.?
That's the critical question.
Like, is Washington going to transfer top-tier processing technology to Indian firms, or are they just looking for a new non-Chinese factory floor to process American rocks?
Well, it's driven by mutual vulnerability,
Right.
but the ambitions on both sides are actually deeply domestic.
Okay, how so?
The United States desperately needs a trusted jurisdiction to process materials outside of Chinese borders.
Sure.
And India, as a strategic partner and a Quad member, offers a massive labor force, a favorable geography, and a government that's super eager to build industrial capacity.
Right.
But from New Delhi's perspective, this isn't just about being a service provider for American tech companies. Think about India's domestic economic roadmap right now.
Oh, like the green energy push.
Exactly. You have the PM Surya Ghar initiative pushing massive solar panel deployment. You have the PM eDrive scheme trying to put millions of EVs on Indian roads.
The Tata Electronics semiconductor fab in Dholera.
Yes. And crucially, you have the Make in India defense indigenization push.
Yeah.
Manufacturing Tejas fighter jets, advanced DRDO missile systems, submarines.
Every single one of those domestic initiatives will just slam into a brick wall without a secure supply of these processed critical minerals.
Precisely.
So the U.S. brings the capital, the advanced metallurgical partnerships, and the demand, while India brings the raw reserves, the industrial scale, and its own massive captive market.
Exactly. And looking at the broader diplomatic maneuvering, this bilateral framework is just one node in a much larger multilateral web.
Right. India joined the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership back in 2022.
Yeah, the MSP. There's also the PAC Silica Initiative for Semiconductors.
Hmm.
And right alongside this bilateral signing, the Quad itself announced a joint $20 billion critical minerals initiative.
So we're actively partnering with Australia, the world's largest lithium producer, and Canada, a major cobalt player.
You're literally watching the real-time architectural design of a parallel global economy.
That's wild to think about.
It is. The fact that Jaishankar and Rubio signed this critical minerals framework in the margins of the Quad foreign ministers meeting is incredibly telling.
How so?
Because it illustrates that in the 21st century, traditional military security and supply chain security are practically indistinguishable.
Right, you can't have one without the other.
Exactly. You cannot secure the Indo-Pacific with warships if you rely on your primary adversary to build the radar systems on those exact same ships.
Wow. And that transition between economic security and physical security brings us directly into the main event that was happening in the room next door.
The Quad FMM.
Let's move from the minerals in the ground to the waters of the Indo-Pacific. So on that same day, May 26, New Delhi hosted the Quad foreign ministers meeting. Jaishankar, Rubio, Australia's Penny Wong, Japan's Toshimitsu Motegi.
A heavy-hitting room.
Very heavy-hitting. And often, these diplomatic summits produce a lot of high-minded rhetoric and very little action. But this time, they rolled out a highly technical operational initiative.
They did.
They announced a new maritime surveillance and domain awareness initiative aimed at creating a common operating picture for Indo-Pacific shipping lanes.
The COP. Yeah.
I want to break down that specific phrase. In military and maritime terms, what exactly does building a common operating picture actually entail?
Well, a common operating picture is basically the holy grail of multinational military coordination.
Okay.
Historically, maritime surveillance has been highly siloed. The Indian Navy tracks a suspicious vessel in the Bay of Bengal using its coastal radar.
Right.
The Japanese Coast Guard spots a different anomaly near the Senkaku Islands using satellite imagery. And the U.S. Navy picks up electronic signals in the South China Sea.
So everyone's looking at their own separate screens.
Exactly. And in the past, sharing that information involved sending cables, formatting reports, and just dealing with massive bureaucratic lag.
Which takes forever.
Right. So a common operating picture means that the operation centers of all four Quad nations, and eventually their regional partners, are looking at the exact same integrated, near real-time digital map. Yeah. It merges automatic identification system data, which are the transponders commercial ships use, with military radar, satellite synthetic aperture radar, and patrol aircraft feeds.
I'm trying to visualize the sheer data processing power required for this. It sounds like they're trying to build an encrypted Google Maps for the entire ocean.
That's a great way to think about it.
Just tracking tens of thousands of moving vessels simultaneously. And what is really interesting is that the foundation for this already exists in India.
Right, in Gurugram.
Yes, they're building this upon the Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region, the IFC-IOR, which the Indian Navy set up back in 2018.
And that center already has international liaison officers sitting in the room taking in data from over 50 partner nations.
Right, so the Quad isn't starting from scratch here. They're essentially taking India's existing maritime dashboard, plugging in massive American, Japanese, and Australian sensor networks, and just supercharging it.
That is the mechanical reality of the initiative, yeah. And the practical application of this common operating picture is vast. They're specifically targeting what's called dark shipping.
Dark shipping.
Yeah. These are vessels that intentionally turn off their AIS transponders to avoid detection. Sometimes they are engaging in illegal fishing, which is a huge drain on small island nations.
Right. Or smuggling.
Exactly. Narcotics or weapons. But quite often, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, dark shipping refers to state-backed maritime militia vessels. Ships that are used to bully smaller nations, assert illegal territorial claims, or conduct covert surveillance. By fusing satellite data with regional radar, the Quad can track these vessels even when they try to go dark.
And then share that track with the local Coast Guard so they can intercept it.
Exactly.
And speaking of those Pacific Island nations, the Quad didn't just announce digital surveillance software. They announced physical concrete.
Yes, the port project.
Under a new Ports of the Future partnership, Secretary Rubio announced a joint Quad project to fund and develop physical port infrastructure in Fiji.
Which is huge.
If you follow the history of the Quad, this is a massive operational shift. I mean, the Quad does vaccine distribution, climate working groups, joint statements. but pouring concrete for a deep-water port in the South Pacific.
Yeah, that is stepping directly onto the geopolitical chessboard and making a physical countermove against Beijing.
It's a direct response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Over the last decade, China has been systematically funding ports, airstrips, and telecom infrastructure across Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea.
And the strategic fear in Washington, Canberra, and New Delhi is that today's commercial deep-water port becomes tomorrow's naval logistics hub.
Exactly, giving the Chinese Navy permanent operational reach deep into the South Pacific, effectively cutting off sea lines of communication between the U.S. and Australia.
It's the classic debt trap diplomacy model mixed with strategic expansion. But, you can't fight physical infrastructure with angry joint statements. You have to offer a viable alternative.
Right, you need cash.
If a Pacific Island nation needs a port to export its fish, and Beijing is the only one offering a loan, they're going to take the loan.
Of course they are.
India has been trying to offer alternatives through the FIPIC framework, but India's development budget is limited.
So by bringing the combined financial weight, engineering expertise, and developmental agencies of the U.S., Japan, and Australia to bear in Fiji, the Quad is finally trying to provide a compelling, transparent alternative.
It is a vital step, but it also brings us to the core structural vulnerability of the Quad itself. Because despite the COP and the Fiji port project, there is this massive undercurrent of anxiety regarding the grouping's long-term viability.
Oh, definitely.
The Quad is an ad hoc arrangement. It doesn't have a formal physical secretariat. It doesn't have a founding treaty or a legally binding charter like NATO.
It exists solely through the political will and the scheduling alignment of 4 national leaders.
And this is exactly where the specter of domestic American politics enters the room. There are growing, serious questions about whether the Quad Leaders Summit, scheduled for late 2026, will even take place.
With Donald Trump back in the White House, his historically transactional approach to foreign policy is causing extreme nervousness in New Delhi, Tokyo, and Canberra.
Right. His administration is currently hyper-focused on bilateral trade tariffs with China, domestic economic restructuring, and the explosive situation in the Middle East.
So if the U.S. president decides that flying across the world for a Quad summit doesn't yield an immediate transactional benefit, the summit gets downgraded or canceled.
And if the Leaders Summit is downgraded, the political momentum of the entire enterprise stalls. Bureaucracies only move when they know the heads of state are going to demand deliverables.
India is acutely aware of this structural fragility. New Delhi views the Quad as a vital insurance policy to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific.
But it increasingly feels like the primary underwriter of that policy, the United States, might be losing interest in paying the premium.
That's the fear. And if the Quad weakens, India will be forced to rely entirely on strict transactional bilateral arrangements, like that critical minerals deal we just discussed.
Now, the ministers in New Delhi did attempt to project unity. They issued a very firm joint statement condemning the April 2025 terror attack in Pahalgam, called for a crackdown on those massive transnational scam centers in Southeast Asia,
Right.
and reiterated their absolute opposition to any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the South China Sea.
However,
If you read the transcripts of the press briefings, the most urgent, visceral language didn't actually concern the Pacific Theater at all.
no, it didn't.
Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio were explicitly, intensely focused on a completely different body of water.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Yes. Rubio went on record calling Iran's actions unlawful, illegal, unsustainable, and unacceptable, and vehemently opposed any attempt to impose tolls on global commerce.
And the focus was on Hormuz, because while these diplomats were sitting in a secure room in New Delhi discussing the theoretical necessity of keeping sea lanes open, the most critical energy choke point on the planet was literally under military fire.
Which bridges us perfectly to our third topic, the escalating U.S.-Iran conflict and the terrifying macroeconomic fallout.
Yeah, this is a big one.
To understand how we arrived at this point, we have to look at the timeline of the collapse. The current acute phase of this crisis kicked off with combined U.S. and Israeli military operations targeting Iranian assets on February 28, 2026.
Right.
After weeks of escalating retaliation, Pakistan managed to step in and broker a highly fragile 2-week ceasefire on April 8th. But that ceasefire has been a fiction almost from the moment it was signed.
Complete fiction.
On April 21st, President Trump announced an extension of the ceasefire to allow for broader negotiations. Iran immediately rejected the U.S. proposed 45-day framework and submitted their own counterdemands via a 10-point plan.
And that diplomatic stalemate brings us to the operational reality on the ground. Fast forward to May 25 and 26, the exact days the Quad was meeting in India.
Yep.
The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, executed kinetic military strikes in southern Iran. They specifically targeted Iranian missile launch infrastructure and fast attack boats that were allegedly laying naval mines in the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, I have to pause here and look at the sheer cognitive dissonance of the official messaging.
It's pretty wild.
CENTCOM releases a statement calling these operations self-defense strikes. CENTCOM spokesperson literally stood at a podium and claimed the military was using restraint during the ongoing ceasefire.
Using restraint by dropping bombs.
Let's be intellectually honest for a second. How on earth can a military command launch targeted airstrikes against sovereign territory, blow up missile sites and naval vessels, and characterize that as restraint during a ceasefire?
It's absurd.
It is the equivalent of throwing a haymaker punch in the middle of a boxing ring and calmly explaining to the referee that you were just vigorously high-fiving your opponent.
That is exactly what it is.
And to add to the surreal nature of this, at the exact moment CENTCOM is dropping bombs, President Trump is posting on social media that the diplomatic negotiations with Tehran are proceeding nicely.
The messaging is wildly contradictory, absolutely.
Right.
But if you strip away the political spin, it reveals the agonizing strategic dilemma both sides are trapped in.
Okay, what's the dilemma?
To understand why this ceasefire keeps violently collapsing, you have to look at the structural flaw in the agreement itself, the U.S.-Israel coordination problem. The terms of the ceasefire nominally cover the actions of U.S. forces and Iranian forces. It entirely omits the ongoing Israeli military operations in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, which routinely target Iranian proxy networks and Revolutionary Guard commanders.
So Iran's position is essentially, we won't shoot at you if you make your ally stop shooting at us.
Yes. But the U.S. maintains they do not possess the operational control to dictate Israeli military targeting.
So the legal and operational disconnect is fatal to the truce.
Every time Israel executes a strike that kills an Iranian operative, Tehran views the overarching ceasefire as void. They escalate in response, usually by harassing shipping or moving military assets near the strait.
The U.S. military detects that movement, determines it poses a threat, and launches what they call preemptive self-defense strikes. It's a deadly, self-perpetuating feedback loop.
Exactly. And it is further complicated by the fact that the Iranian government is not a monolith. You have intense internal factional warfare.
Between who?
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, represents the hardline military wing. They derive their power from conflict. On the other side, you have the more pragmatic foreign ministry, which is desperately trying to negotiate back-channel economic relief.
So if the foreign ministry gets close to a diplomatic breakthrough, the IRGC has a vested interest in initiating naval provocations in Hormuz to deliberately sabotage those talks.
Exactly. Force the West into a kinetic response. And the factional dynamics are mirrored in Washington.
Right, midterm elections are coming up.
The Trump administration desperately wants a diplomatic deal that lowers global oil prices because high gas prices destroy incumbent governments. However, their entire political brand is built on projecting absolute strength.
They can't afford to look weak.
Right. So they attempt this bizarre balancing act, conducting limited military strikes to maintain deterrence, while simultaneously claiming the ceasefire is intact to keep the diplomatic channels open.
But while Washington and Tehran play this geopolitical game of chicken, the collateral damage to the global economy is becoming catastrophic.
Oh, it's brutal.
The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that narrow channel.
20%.
And since February, Iran has effectively crippled transit using asymmetric naval warfare, sea mines, fast attack craft. And now the situation has escalated from physical harassment to a legal and economic threat. Iran is threatening to formalize a permanent tolling system on all commercial traffic passing through Hormuz.
Which is a blatant, unequivocal violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS.
You can't just set up a toll booth in international waters.
Exactly. But the threat alone, combined with the naval mines, has caused maritime insurance premiums to absolutely skyrocket. Shipping companies are either paying exorbitant war risk insurance or taking the massive logistical hit of rerouting entirely.
And for you, the listener, This is exactly where abstract geopolitics violently collides with your personal finances. Look at the commodities markets. Because of this disruption, Brent crude oil is currently sitting above $115 a barrel.
And analysts warn it could breach 130 if the strikes continue.
Let's look at the mechanical impact on India. India imports roughly 70 to 80% of its crude oil requirements. When the price of Brent crude spikes by $30 or $40 a barrel, it triggers a devastating macroeconomic cascade.
It all falls like dominoes.
First, the country's import bill balloons, which immediately widens the current account deficit. To pay for that expensive oil, importers have to sell rupees and buy dollars, which depreciates the value of the rupee.
And a weaker rupee makes all other imports more expensive. It creates a massive wave of imported inflation.
The cost of fuel at the pump goes up, which means the cost of transporting every single good from vegetables to construction materials increases.
The RBI is then forced to keep interest rates high to fight that inflation, which chokes off domestic business borrowing.
A conflict in a 21-mile strait thousands of miles away directly dictates the price of tomatoes in a Delhi market and the EMI on a home loan in Mumbai.
Which puts the Indian government in a seemingly impossible diplomatic bind.
Because we need the strait open, but we can't just condemn Tehran.
Right. India has deeply entrenched strategic interests with Iran. We've invested heavily in developing the Chabahar port in southeastern Iran, which is our primary strategic gateway to Afghanistan and Central Asia, allowing us to bypass Pakistan entirely.
So India is forced to walk a diplomatic tightrope over a geopolitical volcano. If you read the statements coming out of South Bloc, the MEA advocates for freedom of navigation and open sea lanes. But notice what they don't say.
They never name names.
They almost never explicitly name the United States or Iran as a primary aggressor.
Right.
They're attempting to maintain leverage with both, positioning themselves as a neutral bridge builder.
It is a masterclass in diplomatic ambiguity born of pure economic necessity.
It really is. We are watching external national borders and international sea lanes being violently contested. But our next topic brings the profound, often volatile concept of borders, security, and belonging directly inside the country.
This next one is highly sensitive.
It is. Before we dive into this, I want to establish a very clear framework for you, the listener. The sources we are about to unpack deal with highly charged, deeply polarizing political and social narratives regarding demographics and citizenship.
All right.
Our mission on this deep dive is not to take a side. We are not here to validate or invalidate the political claims made by the government or the opposition. Our job is to impartially analyze the policy mechanisms, break down the complex legal frameworks being utilized, and clearly present the arguments from all sides as they exist in the source material.
We are unpacking the structural machinery, not endorsing a viewpoint.
Exactly. So with that established, let's look at the structural machinery. On May 26, 2026, Home Minister Amit Shah formally announced the constitution of a high-level committee on demographic change.
Headed by a retired Supreme Court judge, Justice Prakash Prabhakar Nilekar.
Right. To understand the genesis of this committee, we have to look back at the political timeline. The public foundation was laid during Prime Minister Modi's Independence Day speech from the Red Fort on August 15, 2025.
In that address, the Prime Minister spoke of a high-powered mission to investigate what he explicitly termed a premeditated conspiracy to alter the country's demography through illegal infiltration.
Following that speech, the Union Cabinet officially approved the formation of the panel in September 2025, and now we are seeing the operational rollout. Joining Justice Nalekar on the committee are senior officials from the Census Commissioner's Office, a former Chief Secretary of UP, an IPS officer, and economist Shamika Ravi.
It's a very high-powered group.
Let's look at the actual paperwork. What is the specific documented mandate given to this committee?
According to the official notifications cited in our sources, the committee has a massive fourfold mandate. First, they are tasked with conducting a comprehensive, nationwide assessment of demographic changes caused by illegal immigration, as well as what the government broadly terms unnatural causes.
Unnatural causes, okay.
Second, they are instructed to analyze patterns of these abnormal population shifts, and they are specifically directed to look at these shifts at the levels of religious and social communities.
That's a huge task.
Third, they must evaluate the impact of these demographic changes on national sovereignty, internal security, law and order, and tribal cultures. Finally, they have to draft time-bound solutions.
To truly grasp the implications of that mandate, we have to contextualize it within the broader policy narrative of the current NDA government. For years, the ruling party has argued that sustained illegal immigration, specifically pointing to porous borders with Bangladesh, is systematically altering the communal and ethnic composition of vital border districts.
They point to shifting demographics in states like Assam, West Bengal, Tripura, Bihar, and UP.
The Home Minister has frequently summarized the government's operational approach as detect, delete, deport. The goal is to detect undocumented immigrants, delete their names from electoral rolls, and physically deport them.
And we cannot evaluate this policy shift without acknowledging the immediate security environment, right? The sources reference Operation Sindoor, which took place in May 2025.
Right, the military clashes along the India-Pakistan border.
Exactly. When a nation goes through a severe border security crisis, the domestic political focus inevitably turns inward to internal security. That post-Operation Sindoor environment definitely injected a massive sense of political urgency into this demographic debate.
But let's strip away the political rhetoric and look at the actual legal machinery required to execute a mandate like detect, delete, deport. How does the state physically and legally differentiate a citizen from an undocumented immigrant on a nationwide scale?
It is an incredibly complex web of interconnected laws. You have the Foreigners Act of 1946, which places the legal burden of proof entirely on the individual to prove they are not a foreigner.
Guilty until proven innocent, essentially.
In terms of citizenship, yes. You also have the National Register of Citizens, the NRC, which is meant to be a verified ledger of legal citizens. And you have the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, the CAA.
Which changed everything.
It fundamentally altered the landscape by creating a fast-track pathway to Indian citizenship for religious minorities, specifically Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, and Parsis, who fled persecution in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, and entered India before December 31st, 2014.
But crucially, the CAA explicitly excludes Muslim immigrants from that accelerated pathway.
Right, which makes the execution of any nationwide demographic audit legally and administratively explosive. The source material frequently points back to the precedents set by the 2019 Assam NRC.
Walk me through what happened in Assam.
That exercise was an attempt to definitively identify illegal immigrants in Assam based on legacy data and historical documents. It was a massive, years-long bureaucratic undertaking. Millions of people had to produce decades-old land records and birth certificates.
Which many poor people just don't have.
Exactly. When the final NRC list was published, it excluded roughly 19.06 lakh people. And to the shock of many political architects of the exercise, a very significant proportion of those excluded individuals turned out to be Hindus who simply lacked the proper historical paperwork.
So the administrative chaos was just immense.
The human suffering involved in proving citizenship via legacy documents was so profound that the central government ultimately declined to even officially notify or publish the final Assam NRC list due to massive concerns over its accuracy.
If identifying citizens in a single border state resulted in that level of systemic failure and political blowback, the idea of expanding a similar logic nationwide under this new committee is staggering.
It really is.
I want to turn to the pushback. When we look at the source material, what are the specific arguments being raised by civil society groups, legal scholars, and academics against the formation and mandate of this panel?
The pushback is fierce, and it categorizes into three distinct arenas: constitutional law, academic methodology, and the structure of federalism.
Let's start with the Constitution.
Civil society groups point immediately to Article 14, which guarantees equality before the law and equal protection of the laws. Their core legal apprehension is rooted in the committee's specific mandate to analyze population shifts at the levels of religious communities.
Right.
They argue that framing the demographic audit through a religious lens, combined with the selective protections of the CAA, creates a legal apparatus that could be weaponized to disproportionately target specific minority communities under the guise of identifying illegal immigrants.
And what is the argument coming from the academic community? How do statisticians view the concept of unnatural demographic change?
Academics argue that the very premise of the committee's mandate lacks scientific rigor. Demographers point out that populations grow or shrink due to a vast matrix of socioeconomic factors.
Like what?
Variations in female literacy rates, access to contraception, differing baseline fertility rates, rapid urbanization, massive internal labor migration.
So it's not just infiltration.
Academics argue that immediately attributing localized population shifts to illegal cross-border infiltration, without controlling for these domestic socioeconomic trends, is a scientifically flawed methodology designed to yield a predetermined political conclusion.
And then we hit the logistical reality of the Indian state. the federalism clash. Demography, citizenship, and international borders are strictly union subjects. The central government writes the laws.
But New Delhi cannot physically conduct a demographic audit or execute deportations without utilizing the local police forces and the district magistrates of the state governments.
Exactly. And several of the key border states identified in this narrative, states like West Bengal and Jharkhand, are currently governed by opposition parties.
And those chief ministers have fundamentally rejected the central government's narrative on infiltration and stated they would not cooperate with nationwide NRC initiatives.
It creates the perfect storm for a constitutional and administrative standoff. It is a profound debate about the definition of belonging, the burden of proving that belonging, and which level of government holds the ultimate authority to make that existential determination.
It is a massive systemic stress test.
It is. But interestingly, our next topic takes this massive concept of eviction, belonging, and state authority, and shrinks the microscope down to a hyper-localized level.
We're moving from the borders to central Delhi.
Exactly. From the vast expanse of national borders to a 27.3-acre plot of manicured lawns and tennis courts. On May 22, 2026, the central government's Land and Development Office, the LNDO, issued a formal eviction notice to the Delhi Gymkhana Club,
Giving them an ultimatum to completely vacate by June 5.
If you are not familiar with Delhi geography, we are talking about some of the most expensive, exclusive, prime real estate in the entire country, located a stone's throw away from the PM's official residence.
And the justification provided by the LNDO in the eviction notice is incredibly stark. They stated that the land is critically required for the strengthening and securing of defense infrastructure and other vital public security purposes.
Faced with an existential threat, the club immediately rushed to the Delhi High Court seeking an interim stay, but the court declined to grant immediate protection.
SG Tushar Mehta assured the bench that the government would strictly follow due process, and the judge ruled the club's apprehensions were premature.
To truly grasp the shockwaves this eviction notice sent through the corridors of power, you have to understand the history of the institution. The Delhi Gymkhana Club is a monument to colonial and post-colonial elite power.
Founded in 1913.
Right. In 1928, as part of Lukian's grand architectural design for the new capital, the club was allotted this massive tract of land on a perpetual lease. I want to dig into the mechanics of that term because it sounds like an oxymoron.
It is a bit confusing.
Imagine having a lease that your family has held for a century, paying absolute pennies compared to the market rate. You treat the property as if you own it. But suddenly, your landlord, the sovereign government, says, actually, we need this land back to build a military installation. You have 2 weeks to leave.
It's historically shocking, but legally sound.
What exactly is a perpetual lease, and how does the government possess the power to simply tear it up?
The terminology is deceptive. A perpetual lease essentially means a lease agreement that does not have a fixed expiration date. It doesn't automatically end after 99 years. However, the critical caveat is that it is still a lease.
So it's not freehold property.
Exactly. The ultimate ownership of the land remains vested in the President of India. Under these historical agreements, the government retains the sovereign right to unilaterally terminate the lease if the lessee breaches the terms, or, most importantly, if the land is required for a broader public purpose.
And once that lease is terminated by the LNDO, the legal status of the club changes instantly, doesn't it?
The moment the lease is canceled, they are no longer a legal tenant. They become an unauthorized occupant of government land. At that exact moment, the government invokes the Public Premises Act of 1971.
Which is very powerful.
It bypasses the civil courts entirely. It empowers an estate officer to conduct a rapid, summary eviction process. It is designed to be swift and ruthless.
And reading the source material, it's clear this eviction didn't happen in a vacuum. Between 2022 and 2024, the Delhi Gymkhana was embroiled in severe internal governance and financial controversies.
The central government actually intervened directly, appointed an administrator, and attempted to restructure its membership rules.
Many saw that as a political attempt to break the hold of the old bureaucratic elite over the institution. But now the government isn't just trying to change the rules of the club, they're literally reclaiming the dirt the club is built on, using defense and national security as the legal justification.
And critics argue that this is a brilliant legal maneuver because challenging an eviction in court is nearly impossible when the government invokes national security.
This specific eviction forces us to look at a much broader policy question. Our sources indicate the LNDO has been systematically issuing similar land reclamation notices to other colonial-era institutions in the Lutyens bungalow zone.
The Delhi racecourse, the polo ground.
So the fundamental debate here is about spatial fairness and resource allocation. The argument for eviction is quite compelling. Why should exclusive colonial-era clubs, which cater to an infinitesimally small fraction of the ultra-elite, be allowed to retain hundreds of acres of prime real estate, paying concessional lease rates?
Shouldn't that land serve a broader public purpose?
That is the egalitarian argument. But our sources also highlight a massive caution flag being raised by real estate experts and legal scholars. Their anxiety is not about saving a country club. Their anxiety is about legal precedent.
Exactly. If the government can easily terminate a century-old perpetual lease by vaguely citing an undefined public purpose and use the 1971 Act to execute a summary eviction in 2 weeks, what does that mean for everyone else?
We are talking about major schools, charitable hospitals, and religious institutions that also sit on government land under old lease agreements. If you are wondering why this matters to you, that is exactly why. It's about the stability of the rules.
It's a dispute about who gets to occupy privileged spaces.
And speaking of fierce debates over fairness, access to privileged spaces, and manipulating the rules when the stakes are incredibly high, that brings us perfectly into our sixth topic.
Medical college admissions.
The brutal battleground of NEET. The catastrophic cancellation of the NEET UG 2026 exam due to paper leaks has triggered a massive push to alter how the exam is conducted.
The K-Radicrishan Committee recommended moving to a computer-based test, a CBT format.
Similar to how the JE Main is currently conducted for engineering. But there is a massive, mathematically complex hurdle here, and it revolves around a statistical concept called score normalization.
Let's establish the basics. If you want to test 25 lakh medical aspirants on computers, you don't have the physical infrastructure to test them all at the exact same time.
You have to break the exam up into multiple shifts.
Yes, and when you introduce multiple shifts, you introduce multiple distinct question papers. You cannot give the students on Tuesday the same paper the students took on Monday.
Right.
And here is the reality. No matter how meticulously an expert panel attempts to balance the difficulty, some question papers will be slightly harder and some will be slightly easier. This introduces a massive variable of luck.
Which is where normalization comes in.
Exactly. It's a mathematical algorithm used to convert a student's raw score into a comparable, standardized percentile. It mathematically smooths out the variations in difficulty across different shifts.
Let's dive into the actual math, because our sources provide the exact formula used by the NTA for the JEE Main. They calculate the percentile by taking 100, multiplying it by the number of candidates in that specific session who achieved a raw score equal to or less than the candidate, and then dividing that by the total number of candidates in that session.
And they calculate it out to 7 decimal places to aggressively prevent ties.
Now, engineering aspirants have lived with this algorithm for years, and the system functions relatively smoothly. Why does this normalization math work seamlessly for JEE Main, but trigger absolute legal and emotional chaos when proposed for NEET?
It comes down to scale and the brutal nature of the competition. Let's look at why normalization succeeds in JHang. First, JMain has roughly 1.3 million candidates. You can comfortably accommodate that across 9 or 10 shifts.
Okay.
But most importantly, the JE Main system has built-in safety valves. It offers students 2 attempts per year. If you get a tough shift in January and feel the algorithm crushed your percentile, you have an immediate second chance in April.
And the admissions aren't a pure zero-sum game. There are tens of thousands of engineering seats across IITs and NITs. The cutoff is a gradient.
Exactly.
Try to explain it using this analogy. Using normalization in the JE is like using a handicap system in a local friendly golf tournament. Everyone knows the math isn't perfect, but they accept it, play the game, and move on.
I like that.
Using that exact same normalization formula in NEET is like trying to use a statistical handicap to decide who gets the absolute last life raft on the sinking Titanic. The stakes are simply too existentially high for mathematical adjustments to be accepted.
That is a dark but entirely accurate illustration. Let's look at the terrifying mechanics of NEET. You have 25 lakh candidates competing for a highly restricted pool of roughly 1,010,000 viable MBBS seats.
It's a bloodbath.
To test 25 lakh students on computers, the NTA would need to conduct approximately 20 separate shifts. That means generating 20 entirely different question papers of exactly equal difficulty.
Which is impossible.
Right. In NEET, the competition is so hyper-condensed that a single rank difference, say rank 1,010,000 versus rank 1,010,001, determines whether your lifelong dream of becoming a doctor is alive or dead.
When the margins are that razor-thin, relying on an opaque statistical algorithm creates massive volatility. Let me push you on the math here. Give me a hypothetical of how this actually hurts a student.
Okay, let's look at the formula. It divides your position by the total candidates in your specific session. Imagine student A is brilliant. They get an easy paper, but crucially, they are randomly assigned to a shift filled with other brilliant, highly prepared students.
Okay, so a very smart group.
Because so many students in that specific session scored high raw marks, student A's relative percentile within that group gets mathematically compressed downwards.
Ah, I see.
Now imagine student B, who is average, but gets a tough paper in a shift filled with underprepared students. Student B's percentile gets artificially inflated. A difference of 0.0001 in that final normalization percentile, caused entirely by the random luck of your shift assignment, can drop you 500 ranks and cost you a medical seat.
And the sources point out that the candidate pool for NEET is wildly heterogeneous, which totally corrupts the assumptions of the formula.
Huge variation.
You have students prepped in elite coaching factories competing against students in rural government schools. You have massive variations in state board standards. Students from Tamil Nadu or Bihar have violently protested that their specific question sets were intentionally tougher, or the normalization math inherently disadvantaged their demographic profile.
If you try to apply a 7-decimal formula to 20 shifts across those starkly different demographics, the perception of unfairness is immediate. It instantly manifests as tens of thousands of writ petitions filed in high courts.
The judiciary is acutely aware of this nightmare. The sources note that in a recent case regarding the NEET PG exam, the Supreme Court specifically intervened and instructed the board to conduct the test in a single, unified shift to avoid this arbitrariness.
The highest court in the land is fundamentally skeptical of this math when medical seats are on the line.
Which leaves the NTA and the Ministry of Education trapped in a brutal administrative paradox. They desperately need to stop the physical paper leaks. The only way is to eliminate the physical transportation of paper and move to computers.
But they cannot fully transition to CBT because they cannot survive the legal fallout of normalization across 20 shifts.
So our sources note they are exploring a fascinating hybrid model as an emergency bridge solution for the upcoming June 21 re-exam. Walk me through the logistics.
The hybrid model attempts to marry digital security with analog fairness. Here is how it functions. The NTA entirely eliminates the physical transit chain. There are no printing presses weeks in advance, no courier trucks, no bank-strong rooms where papers sit for days.
Which is exactly where leaks traditionally occur.
Right. Instead, the question paper is encrypted and transmitted digitally from NTA headquarters to the individual exam centers just minutes before the exam begins.
So the data moves electronically, securing the transit. But how do the students take the test?
Once the encrypted file arrives at the center, it is decrypted, and the question papers are printed locally right there in the exam hall using high-speed printers and tamper-proof paper. The students then sit down and answer the questions physically, filling out traditional OMR bubble sheets with a pen.
It's an elegant hack. By having everyone answer on physical paper simultaneously, they can still conduct the exam in a single, massive, nationwide shift.
Because it's a single shift with a single question paper, you completely eliminate the need for the dreaded normalization algorithm. Everyone faces the exact same questions under the exact same conditions.
The government has announced a plan to figure out the math and shift to a full CBT model by 2027. But this hybrid model is the duct tape holding the system together right now. It is entirely about attempting to restore trust.
When futures are dictated by complex mathematical formulas, absolute transparency is the only thing preventing societal collapse.
But what happens when the institution actively manipulating numbers to hide the reality of its operations isn't an overwhelmed examination board, but rather India's largest, most prestigious private bank?
That brings us to our seventh and final topic.
On May 26, 2026, an explosive investigative report by the Indian Express blew the lid off a massive internal vigilance probe currently underway at HDFC Bank.
A massive story.
The investigation centers on a highly suspicious series of payments. totaling roughly 45 crore rupees, made to the Maharashtra State Road Development Corporation, the MSRDC, spread over the financial years of 2024 and 2025.
This isn't just an accounting error. It's an allegation of systemic misclassification designed to bypass central bank regulations.
Let's break down the mechanics. What exactly was the true nature of these payments?
To understand the alleged fraud, we have to understand how banks acquire the deposits they need to fund their lending operations. The MSRDC is a massive state government entity. Entities like that sit on mountains of operational cash, and they park that cash in banks.
Right, huge sums.
When you're a depositor of that scale, you naturally demand the highest possible interest rate on your deposits. The core allegation here is that the MSRDC approached HDFC Bank and demanded an interest rate that was significantly higher than the standard rate the bank offers to regular customers.
But banks can't just operate like a street bazaar, haggling over deposit rates in back rooms, can they? The Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, enforces very strict master directions.
Exactly. The RBI's master directions explicitly prohibit banks from offering differential, secretly negotiated interest rates to specific individual depositors, even massive government entities.
You can't just invent a custom rate to win a client's business.
Right. The RBI enforces this to prevent a race to the bottom that could destroy profit margins and lead to systemic banking failures.
So HDFC Bank was trapped. They desperately wanted the massive MSRDC deposits, but they couldn't legally pay the higher interest rate without triggering an RBI audit. So how did they financially compensate them?
According to the internal investigation, the bank allegedly constructed a shadow accounting mechanism. They routed the extra money through their marketing department.
Right, marketing.
Yeah. They disguised the 45 crore rupee payment not as interest, but as a corporate sponsorship for a road safety awareness campaign run by the MSRDC. And to further obscure the paper trail, they dispersed these marketing funds through 4 distinct third-party local vendors.
I am genuinely struggling to comprehend the sheer audacity of this. Imagine if you went to your bank manager and said, I have a lot of money, give me 10% interest instead of 5%.
And the manager says, I can't do that legally, but I'll pay you 5%, and my marketing department will hire you as a consultant and pay you the difference.
It is basically slipping a massive illegal bribe to a client under the table at a restaurant and then telling the tax authorities you just purchased a really, really expensive napkin.
It's the fundamental falsification of the economic reality of the business.
And the accounting implications are profound. They deliberately misclassified a cost of funds, the interest a bank pays as an operating expense, the marketing budget. This manipulation artificially distorts the bank's reported net interest margin,
which is the key metric investors use to judge a bank's health. The entire scheme finally unraveled because a routine internal audit of the marketing department rated its performance as unsatisfactory and flagged these bizarre payouts.
This forced the audit committee of the board to formally intervene in March 2026. And what blows my mind is the defense offered by the marketing department. They explicitly stated it was a business arrangement structured by the retail branch banking team and that the extra funds were provided by the finance department.
That points to systemic cross-departmental collusion. And we cannot ignore the entity involved here. The MSRDC is a state-controlled corporation. The implicit quid pro quo raises terrifying red flags regarding institutional corruption.
Which brings us to the absolute bombshell connection that the source material makes. Earlier in 2026, HDFC Bank's chairman and independent director, Atanu Chakraborty, abruptly resigned. His resignation letter vaguely cited that certain bank practices were not aligning with his personal values and ethics.
If you work in corporate governance, a chairman resigning and explicitly citing values and ethics is the absolute equivalent of pulling the fire alarm and running out of the building.
The market was baffled at the time.
But viewed retrospectively through the lens of this MSRDC investigation, it suggests that knowledge of these severe governance lapses had escalated to the absolute apex of the boardroom.
When the board level of India's largest private sector bank is fractured by internal ethical crises, the regulatory and market implications are systemic.
The market recognized the severity instantly. HDFC shares immediately dropped over 2%. Investors are terrified because HDFC Bank traditionally commanded a governance premium. Institutional investors parked their money there because they trusted the absolute integrity of their accounting ledgers.
Now, that trust is shattered, and they're facing immense regulatory risk. The RBI is not going to look the other way on this. Under the Banking Regulation Act of 1949, the central bank possesses immense punitive powers.
And HDFC has repeatedly found itself in the RBI's crosshairs recently. Fined in 2020 over auto loans, hit with a penalty in 2021 for mis-selling GPS products, penalized in 2025 for KYC non-compliance.
But those were operational failures. Systematically misclassifying core deposit interests to circumvent fundamental rate regulations involving state entities and shadow accounting. It strikes at the very heart of the social contract of banking. It damages the fundamental trust that the entire financial sector relies upon to function.
And that brings us full circle, back to the thought I raised at the very beginning of this deep dive. Structural integrity. Today, we have watched the invisible systems that govern our reality being stress-tested in real time,
Yeah.
often to the point of breaking.
We really have. We saw it internationally, analyzing the complex mechanics behind the U.S. and India's attempt to build new critical mineral supply chains to break a Chinese monopoly. We saw the Quad attempting to deploy digital surveillance to secure the Indo-Pacific.
We saw it violently play out in the Middle East, where the rules of the sea and the structural logic of a ceasefire are completely collapsing.
We saw it domestically, examining the immense constitutional friction generated when a government attempts to utilize blunt legal frameworks to audit demographic borders. We saw the state evict colonial-era clubs from prime land.
And finally, we saw it within our most trusted institutions. The NTA wrestling with the statistical impossibility of normalizing scores for millions of desperate students, and India's largest bank facing an existential crisis over the engineered reality of its own accounting ledger.
It is all connected by that desperate universal need for reliable, transparent structures. And that leaves me with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, as you go about the rest of your day.
What's it?
Today, we've looked at massive, powerful systems attempting to measure, define, and control reality. From 7-decimal normalization algorithms deciding who is worthy of becoming a doctor, to shadow accounting categories deciding how a massive bank reports its financial health to the world. But as technology, geopolitics, and corporate engineering accelerate faster than ever before, our regulatory bodies, from the Reserve Bank of India to the National Testing Agency to the United Nations, actually equipped to govern a world where data, legal definitions, and physical borders are constantly being manipulated and obscured. Think about that the next time you glance at a trusted institution's official report, or assume that a diagnostic chart of our global systems is giving you the whole, clean, unvarnished truth. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.